All right. Thanks so much for being here today, Dr. McIntosh. I appreciate it.
It's a pleasure. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you. So let's just dig right in. And I want to talk a little bit first, just kind of set ground set for everybody. What exactly it is that you do and your specialty as an ENT.
Yeah. So, as people might jump onto board with my accent, I'm from Australia,
Mhm.
and I did my basic ENT training as is the standard, and then when I did an extra year of pediatric fellowship training, and along the journey had an interest develop in upper airway obstruction both in children and adults, and over time that's become quite a strong part of my forte with respect to the types of cases and patients, therefore, that I see.
Mhm.
So, the majority of my work these days is doing something that sounds remarkably simple. It's helping people breathe better, and that has an impact on their health and well-being, and
Mhm.
also ties in strongly with their sleep and sleep quality.
Right. And you made the comment that it sounds remarkably simple. Obviously, it's not.
Well, it's something that we all take for granted with respect to breathing. It's not something that we necessarily are consciously focused on or aware of in terms of how we're breathing. And
Mhm.
then whatever pattern of breathing we develop over time, we accept that as just being the norm. So, if, for example, someone is a mouth breather, then
Mhm.
they grow up thinking that they're a mouth breather and just take that on board as being something that's normal for them and it's no big deal.
Right.
And then when you start digging around the edges, then you can sometimes turn up all these problems that they've got around them that they just again think is just part of who they are.
Mhm.
So part of the complexity is actually just addressing the fact that people are just so unaware of the importance of proper breathing in the first place. And then the next step is, particularly with sleep,
Mhm.
is making parents in particular aware of the fact that snoring is not normal, and that even noisy, heavy breathing is not normal. So part of the challenge is actually just making people aware that there's a problem and that it's not normal.
Mhm. Just educating them.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. And I can honestly say when I was a first time mom, I fell prey to that same, oh look, she's snoring. That's so cute, and now hindsight, you look back and she stopped, obviously, but looking back, I wonder, how many other parents have done that and their child doesn't grow out of it. And here's this underlying issue now that the child is contending with, and parents don't realize that that's a problem.
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely. And just not a criticism of parents. It's not like there's an instruction book that
Right.
that comes that sort of if this red light is on, then please go see ENT because
Right.
breathing is a problem.
Mhm.
So this is again, as you sort of allude to, is the education. But as we'll go ahead and obviously dig into the weeds as we discuss things, we've got to have a perspective here. So when we talk about snoring, mouth breathing, and then there's this thing called sleep apnea. If we're
Mhm.
talking about it specifically in the pediatric population, we're talking about something that's affecting probably 20 to 25% of children in their
Mhm.
developmental years. If you do the simple math on that, that makes this the most common chronic health condition of childhood.
Right.
This is far more common than asthma, far more common than diabetes. I'll guarantee you most parents have heard those two words and have
Mhm.
some sense of what those words mean.
Oh, of
But
course.
if I was to mention the overarching description of this condition, which is sleep disordered breathing, I'll guarantee you that
Mhm.
they'll just get a blank stare from most parents and go, sleep disordered breathing, what's that?
Right.
And then if at a push we might hit a mark on something called sleep apnea, and they might go, oh yeah, I know about that, but that's the worst end of the spectrum of a condition that basically is founded on things that progress over time. You don't wake up, no pun intended, one day with sleep apnea.
Mhm.
There's a process that leads to the evolution and development of these conditions, and all these stepping stones along the way are opportunities and so forth to identify something earlier and actually nip it in the bud. And there's a whole lot of clues that in retrospect, when the child lands on my doorstep, you can start to sort of piece it all together, and then all of a sudden it's like reading an Agatha Christie novel, and it's so obvious at the end of the day where those clues are just staring you in the face. That it's all laid out and it makes so much sense. But again, it's all that in hindsight, not knowing what you
Right.
didn't know, and then when you do know it, and then it all just makes sense. And parents will go, "Oh, that makes so much sense now." Like the penny literally drops with respect to things that had been, question marks in their head and concerns along the way that nobody really thought. And we've all normalized this to some degree. We have this term called the terrible twos, for example.
Right.
That's a term that society uses to write off behavioral issues in young kids.
Mm-hmm.
That's one of the manifestations of sleep disordered breathing. So we've normalized things, and snoring's a perfect example. There's plenty of movies that you can watch, where they have kids snoring, in it, and it's all sort of just representative of the fact that that's part of what you expect to see when the child is asleep, or expect to hear more particularly when the child is asleep.
Right.
And again, no second thought is given to it. But when you know what I know, and then you see that in the movie, then you just face palm and just go, here's another time where, as a society, we've demonstrated our ignorance and our acceptance of a condition that has such a deleterious effect on the development of children. It really does.
Absolutely. And in doing so, we have created or manifested this pandemic, this huge issue that is global, that is,
Yeah.
400 million children right now, and these children are becoming adults. And so now we're impacting the medical systems across the board with a variety of chronic diseases, which we'll discuss, that could have been prevented.
Yeah, and that's what I posted way early on, back when this era of I don't even like using the term COVID anymore. It's, I think we've all got a bit fatigued with it.
Right.
But I posted something that said, imagine if there was an infection that spread throughout children, and it affected 20 to 25% of children, and it caused brain damage.
Mhm.
Imagine there was an infection that did that. How proactive and urgent would we act to address that problem?
Mhm.
That's what sleep disordered breathing is.
Exactly.
It's no different, except the mindset. If there was an infection that spread through children and resulted in them not being able to breathe properly, which had the consequence of affecting their sleep quality and reducing the oxygen supply to the brain and disrupting their sleep patterns, and then in turn affecting their school performance and behavior and so forth. Look, and we had scans that proved it caused brain damage, like literal brain damage
Mhm.
on scan images. We would have a massive healthcare crisis that would be front page of every news service that you could think of. We've got that condition. It just happens that it's
Exactly.
just
It
not an
just
infectious disease per se.
right.
It's already here upon us, and we're
Mhm.
all, again, no pun intended, we're all asleep at the wheel.
Mhm. That's true. That's true. And I'd like to talk a little bit more just so parents understand, because we've mentioned it in a few blogs, and I know it's mentioned on your site as well. Both mouth breathing and sleep disorder breathing impact the brain. I'd like to dig into that a little bit more so parents understand, because I think when you hear that, it sounds so surreal. How is that possible? Okay, so my child is a mouth breather. Aren't they getting more oxygen? That's a good thing.
Mhm.
How do these two, sleep apnea specifically, and mouth breathing, chronic mouth breathing,
Yeah.
impact the brain?
Yeah. So we've used the term sleep disordered breathing. So just to clarify that in terms of what that encompasses. So that's the overarching term. And what
Mm-hmm.
it basically describes is a spectrum. So if we go back historically, how we landed on this page initially is obviously with adults. So we identified way back in the day that there was a group of adults that are having a lot of car accidents. And it turned
Mm-hmm.
out that they were snoring and stopping breathing at night. And that was the obstructive sleep apnea. So they had disrupted sleep. They were tired. They had these little micro moments where they lost their concentration, lost their focus, and as a result had a car accident. So that's how we tripped over it in adults. And then we sort of noticed that there were kids that were snoring and stopping breathing too. So, they had sleep apnea now, but there was a dichotomy because in the adults, the mainstay was that these were significantly overweight, obese people. So that
Mm-hmm.
was the paradigm for obstructive sleep apnea that we developed.
Mm-hmm.
And as a consequence, as a by the by, there's a whole cohort of adults that we completely missed because they weren't obese, they weren't
Right.
overweight, but they had other issues going on, which actually sort of digs into the weeds as why we end up with this as adults in terms of what's founded on in childhood. So it knits together quite nicely. So anyway, but these children, they weren't overweight or obese. If anything, they weren't growing very well. They tend to be tiny and quite thin and scrawny. And we sort of noticed that in that group that the issue was that their tonsils and adenoids in particular, more than anything else, were a problem. And the ENTs started getting involved and removing those tonsils and adenoids. And it was a little bit confronting because in those children, they didn't have tonsillitis, which was our historical focus for the procedure.
Mm-hmm.
But in the process of taking those tonsils and adenoids out, those children started doing better.
Because it
And
removed the obstruction, correct? It
we
opens
were
up.
relieving the obstruction. So all of a
Mm-hmm.
sudden there was a change in breathing and so forth. And the seminal article that came from was David Gazal, who within the circle of Airway is a well-known researcher
Mm-hmm.
and pediatrician in the USA. And what he did back in the late 90s is he went to his local school board and said, look, I just want to send this survey to the kids that are in the bottom 10% of your school grades. And the survey was very simple. Does your child stop breathing at night? Do they snore and stop breathing at night? It was a simple, community screen
Mm-hmm.
for airway obstruction. And where the parents said, oh, yeah, that's my kid. Those children were then offered the opportunity to see an ENT and where appropriate had the tonsil and adenoid surgery. And then fast forward 12 months later, of those children that were managed as per stated, none of them were in the bottom 10% of their class anymore. So
Mm-hmm.
the reason that we tripped over this in children obviously wasn't car accidents, it was academic performance.
Mm-hmm.
But we're still stuck in this paradigm of obstructive sleep apnea. But what we noticed along the way is that there was a group of children who they were snoring, struggling to breathe, but they weren't quite at the point where they were stopping to breathe. They didn't have the apneas. They had just enough basically to fight against it, but they were working really, really hard to do what should have just come normal and naturally. And they weren't having the apneas, but again, they had this pattern, again, historically in the mainstay of tonsil and adenoid problems. And again, the ENTs dipped their toe in the water and started fixing those kids, and they started getting better. And then we started finding that kids that were snoring, again, having breathing, issues. Snoring is a noise that is a sign of airway obstruction. And again, landed on the doorstep of the ENTs. Again, behavior problems, school performance problems. Started
Mm-hmm.
fixing them. They started getting better. And then we tripped over the mouth breathing group and started fixing them. And they started getting better. And then, so that basically encompasses the overarching term that we call sleep disordered breathing, which is a confluence of the fact that the aberrant breathing pattern, whatever it may be, and obviously varying in what we conceptualize as severity,
Mm-hmm.
has an impact on sleep, and that then has an impact on health. And that health issue, as I said, historically is sort of focused on academic things, but we've realized now it's behavioral, and
Mm-hmm.
it's also, for example, ADHD.
Right. The
There's a paper that,
misdiagnosis.
paper that came out in the early 2000s where children were fronting up to an ENT clinic with, again, the paradigm at the time was just obstructive sleep apnea. And there was over 1,000 children, and there's like, well, yeah, the ENT saw them. It's like, yeah, your tonsillant adenoids. But before they did that, they presented these children to psychologists and psychiatrists and said, look, can you make an assessment of these children from your paradigm? How many of these kids have got ADHD? And it was a substantial portion of them met the criteria of ADHD. And then the ETs get thanks, duly noted, went and fixed them because that was what was going to happen anyway. And then 12 months later, brought them back to the psychologists and the psychiatrists and said, how many more of these kids have still got ADHD? And a lot of them didn't. The so-called ADHD was gone.
Right.
So they sort of, depending on, whose doorstep they would have landed on, they either would have got an operation or they would have got medication. And, that just highlights a huge problem. So how does this all evolve and how does this all eventuate? Well, what we need to understand is in children, and this is, one of these despondent facts that as adults we need to come to accept. The child's brain is far more active than an adult's, far more active. And the reason for that is they're going through a massive amount of learning, whether it's the initial stages of learning to feed themselves and then learning to talk and learning to walk and then developing motor skills, learning to write and then hitting school and learning math and reading and sporting things and so on and so forth. Massive amount of learning.
Right.
But what people may not be fully aware of is our learning happens when we sleep. So in terms of what happens is the brain functions by basically having this bucket where it's just everything that happens through the day gets thrown into that bucket. And then at nighttime, there's a sorting and filtering process that goes on where the brain looks at each piece of information and then decides whether that's a keep or a toss. So, for example, you would have seen someone today and they would have been wearing something.
Okay.
Your brain doesn't care about that. That's not a useful piece of information unless you gave it some sort of importance. So, for example, you're like, wow, I really like those shoes. Where do you get those from? And you make what we call a mental note of it. But you
Then
would
it
have seen
becomes a keep.
then the brain goes, oh, there was something about that we want to retain. So we'll put that in the save file. So you think of it like, essentially a computer. But imagine it's a computer that basically needs a clear run at things. It's got this massive amount of data that it needs to process. It has a defined period of time, and it has a defined way that it needs to do. There's a sequence that it needs to follow. But then imagine that computer is plugged into a power supply that is having a power interruption every 10 seconds or every 30 seconds. And the computer needs to shut down, reboot, and start again. It's not going to do what it needs to do very well.
And that's
because
what's happening during sleep apnea.
It doesn't get a clear run at it. And it's because of the sleep disruption, because if there's a disruption in breathing, then the brain needs to go into survival mode and go, oh, all right, I've got to put my attention to something else. That's not where the brain wants to be. People think that when we're asleep, the brain switches off. The brain goes into a very specific mode, and it's learning mode. It obviously needs to tick over in the background because it does all the things that we don't think about. Breathing, monitoring our heart rate, monitoring, all sorts of things that are going on within our system. It's all just on automatic pilot. And we're lucky that we've got that because it allows the rest of our brain to do the other things that we are familiar with. But when we sleep is when we learn. So we have basically the perfect storm, because if you're not breathing properly for whatever reason, then you've got the disrupted sleep architecture, which means that you're not building a house on solid foundations. And furthermore, if you have some form of airway obstruction, then you have an oxygen supply problem. And essentially, the brain to function optimally needs a constant, reliable supply of two things. It needs oxygen and it needs sugar. That's its two magic ingredients. And if there's anything going wrong in that context with the oxygen supply, well, again, that's another layer of problem. So where we sort of run into this thing, I think, in the mainstay, obstructive sleep apnea is an easy one to explain to parents. You say, look, it's choking. And you go,
Mhm.
well, if you're getting choked, of course you're not getting oxygen. That's a
Right.
really easy concept, But where people get lost is say, well, mouth breathing. So, well, they're taking bigger breaths. So they're getting
Exactly.
more air. So if they're
Mhm.
getting more air, they're getting more
Then it
oxygen.
must be good. Right.
So why can this possibly be an issue? So what we need to understand is how the air gets from the outside to the inside. And in very simple terms, when we breathe in, the air goes into our lungs, and
Mhm.
then within our lungs, the blood is flowing, and then there's an interface basically where the air and the blood are allowed to make an exchange, and where basically the deal is that the air will donate oxygen to the blood, and in return, the blood will remove a byproduct of metabolism called carbon dioxide.
Mhm.
And when we breathe out that carbon dioxide. And it's actually the carbon dioxide that regulates our breathing, because the carbon dioxide is a metabolic byproduct that has an impact on our body's sort of fluid level. When we talk about acid and base, or what we call pH, the
Okay.
carbon dioxide level needs to be just right. So the way that body and nature has hacked that for us is actually giving us a way of regulating the carbon dioxide, and in turn regulating the acidity level of our blood through breathing. So breathing is a twofold process. It's not just about getting the oxygen in; it's actually getting the carbon dioxide out.
Okay.
And when we breathe in, we only take a fraction of the oxygen that we actually breathed in. We don't take the whole amount. We take a portion of it. So what needs to happen is that we need to meet up in the middle. We need the air that we breathe to meet up with the blood that flows through the lungs. What happens though is that the blood flow through the lungs is not universally consistent. So there's more, just to keep things simple, just to understand how this matches up. In the mainstay, there's more blood that flows through the bottom of the lung relative to the top of the lung. And when we breathe through our nose, relatively speaking, the lower parts of the lung open up more than the upper parts of the lung. So when we breathe through our nose, the air that we take in, the balance of the volume that we breathe, most of
Mhm.
it is distributed towards the lower parts of our lung, which is advantageous because that's where the majority of the blood is. So we have what we call ventilation, which is basically, all right, we push air into a space. Where does it go to? So we have the ventilation of a space, and we
Right.
have perfusion, which is the blood flow. So we talk about what's called a ventilation perfusion match. And if they're matched up well, then the air and the blood are pretty much akin to being in balance. So we get an optimal system where we get the blood can say basically take the oxygen that it wants and needs. When we're a mouth breather,
Mhm.
that involves taking bigger, breaths, but
Right.
in doing so, we're using different muscles. So when we breathe through our nose, we predominantly use what's called the diaphragm, which is
Mhm.
the lower plunger
Right.
of muscle.
Down here.
And in doing
Mhm.
so, when it pulls down, it opens up the bottom parts of the lung. When we mouth breathe, we tend to use the ribs and the muscles around the upper part of our chest. And as a consequence, that tends to open up the upper part of our lung. So when we ventilate, we end up with, proportionally more air going to the upper parts than the lower parts. And this is what we call a ventilation perfusion mismatch, because the air is going in, but the blood's not there to meet it. So there's no
Mm.
exchange. And as a
Got it.
consequence, there is a whole volume of blood that flows through the lung that completely misses out on oxygen.
Mhm.
So as a result of that, we have this wasted effort. The heart has gone to this significant effort of pumping this blood through the lungs, and the
And
blood
it didn't get what it
basically
needed.
comes through and turns up empty-handed. So
Right.
that's why mouth breathing, in its very simple physiology, results in this very subtle oxygen deprivation. And it is subtle. It doesn't sound like it's a lot when we say it's 2 to 3%, but that's all it takes for the brain. The brain is sitting on this very fragile, tipping point where just 3%, or more is an issue. And if you're a mouth breather, you're already sitting at 2 to 3% deprivation. So you're sitting on the edge of the cliff. And then it just takes just these subtle, little nudges here and there where, you're having to work a little bit harder with your breathing. So you're getting a little bit of a fatigue thing going on. And if you've got, you get a little bit of a cold, and you get just that little bit more blocked. And that's, the parents go, oh, do they snore? And they go, oh, yeah, only when they've got a cold. It's like, well, they're mouth breathing, and they go, oh, yeah, they mouth breathe all the time, and so forth. And then, the little colds, it just makes everything worse. Well, that was that little thing that pushed them over the edge of the cliff. And
That
that's the other
imbalance.
counterbalance to this, is that we have the pernicious, effect of things is basically the net balance of people's exposure to the irritant and their ability to cope with it. So, and this is the only analogy that I can think of. I use smoking as the example.
Okay.
We can identify people that picked up a cigarette at the age of 6 and lived to the age of 110 and smoked a packet of cigarettes for their whole life. Okay. They just had some really good genetics at the end of the day that gave them the resilience to basically survive against all the bad things that we know smoking does. But we don't use that as an example to say, see, smoking's okay. We just go, wow, that person
Because
got
that's
away
an
with it.
outlier.
All right. They got away with it. That's an outlier. And that's the same with this scenario, is that we have a vulnerability level and also therefore a resilience level. And it's it's for some children, they have such a remarkable resilience through their genetics that they can have these airway problems and it actually doesn't affect them. They've basically got this ability to cope. They're an outlier. All right. But that's the exception by far to the rule, just like smoking, to
Right.
the age of 110 is the exception to the rule. And for some children, they just need just a microdose of airway obstruction. They've got no resilience or ability to cope, and they're an absolute mess. But other children really need to get really quite blocked before they sort of, land on our doorstep in terms of it becoming obvious.
And when
So
we're
that's
talking
why we
about a
can have,
mess, it's not just their sleep quality that suddenly becomes impacted. It's a lower IQ, as well as just in general school performance. It's the misdiagnosis of ADHD. It's mental and
yeah,
emotional.
yeah. So you're absolutely right. You sort of, when I say mess, I mean, what I'm talking about is just that landscape then of how we then, from a medical point of view, actually then trip over these kids. And, by the time we're tripping over these kids, the horse has been bolting for a long time and is already way
Mhm.
down out the stable, out the paddock, jumped the fence and off into the distance. And now we're playing catch up to it all. So, that's just a sort of, in simple terms, just to try and explain how we land in the terms of a brain problem. But you've sort of now opened the door and say, well, look, what are the health issues? And if we were to, you could nominate any body system, any body part that you want to nominate. I can tell you how that and it has an impact and a problem. But what's helpful is to just talk about big picture, because the
Okay.
big picture is what we need parents to sort of just realize was that clue. It was that piece of the puzzle where, all of a sudden we can start to join these dots together and then make sense of things. So what I talk about in terms of, the big picture is two body systems: the neurological system, which is the
Mhm.
brain and the nerves, and the cardiovascular system, which is the heart and the blood vessels. And
Okay.
there are two big systems.
Right.
So if we talk about the brain first, what we need to realize is that any behavioral issue is a manifestation of brain function. Anything, right now my words are a manifestation of my brain. Okay. The fact
Okay.
that I'm sitting here in a certain body position is a manifestation of my brain.
Okay.
Everything we do in a physical way, in a mental way, is a manifestation of our brain. So with these children, what I sort of do is I sort of have behavior, education, emotions, their education are sort of clues to are we off on the wrong track? Is this a child that throws tantrums, that gets upset quite easily, has anger management issues, has concentration and focus problems, is
Mm,
disruptive, can't keep to tasks, is a sort of, whether it's enough to call it the ADHD or whatever, just sort of just putting them into a box. But there's that side of things. As I said, their emotions. Do they get upset really easy? That sort of, crying at the drop of a hat type thing. They're really quite fragile and
mm,
delicate, and you got to sort of step around them, because otherwise you're just going to have this thing. And like I said, perfect manifestation of the so-called terrible twos. you
right.
know Perfect manifestation of it. And because as a society we normalize that with that terminology, well, we don't go looking for, is this really way off track.
Hmm.
And then we have their education. Like I said, this is how this first started. Those bottom 10% of the kids. There's a talk that was done many years ago by a sleep physician here in Australia, and the title was, "Can your ENT surgeon make your kids smarter?" And it's not so much about making your child smarter; it's about reaching their full potential. And if they've got breathing and sleep problems, well, look, you got a problem. And
Right.
parents might spend hundreds, if not thousands of dollars on their child's education and tutoring and so forth to help them with their reading and their writing and their math. But they're the things that go off track if their child's got a breathing and sleep problem. So again, it's just sort of going, oh, there's actually something feeding this that's going
Hmm.
on. And then, we talk about brain again, we sort of actually then trip into mental health, as its own category. And then when I sort of say, ADHD, sort of, we sort of put that under the banner of mental health, but we also put anxiety under there. And anxiety is significantly escalated by a factor of 3 to 4 times the
Mm,
background population rate in children, in terms of the so-called child norms, if a child has sleep disordered breathing, 3 to 4 times. Why? Well, in simple terms, again, it's more complex than this, but in simple terms, their brain gets really good at what it gets taught to do. And if they're having breathing problems at night and the brain is having to go into panic mode, and develop, unnecessary but obviously, essential stress responses, well, guess what? That part of the brain got a good workout at night, and guess what? It's going to work really well during the day when it comes to anxiety type issues. But it doesn't stop at anxiety. We then start getting into really significant pathologies. So things such as depression, things
mhm,
such as schizophrenia, psychosis, these things, bipolar affective disorder. These are, psychiatric conditions that can affect children. And in the group of children with sleep disordered breathing, there's an over manifestation. There's a higher rate of such conditions. And these are not insignificant diseases, and affecting children. These are, quite marked,
mhm,
pathologies. And they're often, again, not explored and not asked for, because the child turns up to the doorstep of the psychiatrist and the psychologist, and the paradigm comes with the tunnel vision, of things, and no one's looking outside of their box to see, all right, what else is going on.
mhm.
This is the frustration of healthcare, is that we treat things in silos,
Yes.
and then it's all insulated. So despite the fact that we have the science, we have the research, we have the knowledge that we can point to and say, a child with depression is more likely to have sleep disordered breathing, and therefore we recommend, as psychiatrists that have done this research, that this is a consideration that is made when such children present to clinics. Most psychiatrists, as understandably, don't read ENT journals. It's
Sure.
not on their radar, and again, most ENTs wouldn't be reading psychiatry literature. It's not on their radars. And then all of a sudden we have this silo effect where, we have or, somebody that is yelling at the top of their lungs, but they're encased within a soundproof room and no one's ever going to hear the message until, opportunities like this come along. And then all of a sudden it might be just one person will go, that's my kid. And then they'll go and then they'll say, I think we missed something. And then they'll go and get an intervention. And then from that intervention, they have a different child. And then all of a sudden they get exactly what we need. We get an ambassador, we get an advocate.
I was
They
about to
need to
say,
go,
we're advocating for ourselves and our children. That's kind of where we are at this point.
But all of a sudden we have a convert. We have someone whose eyes have been opened, who goes, I don't want this to happen to another person's child. I had nobody told me about this. I didn't know about this. And then I just do not want this to happen again.
Right.
And it's an unfortunate way for this to play out, but it's a necessary thing for people to, spread this word, spread this message. So anyway, so we can have the mental health, side of things there. So, you think about just what we've listed there, how many kids are struggling at school and needing extra help? How many kids are going through anxiety things at the moment? And, COVID didn't help that, in terms of, the environment that we created. So we've given more opportunity for anxiety to come to the surface. And if they've got a breathing and sleep problem in the background that is opening the door for that to flourish, well, we've just developed the perfect storm. So that's the brain in a nutshell. But what can we do, that's objective? Well, again, we have the research. People have gone and taken a cohort of children and put them through brain scanning protocols. It's not something we do on a clinical level. It's research based. But what did they find? Well, the parts of the brain that deal with concentration and behavior are not working properly. The parts of the brain that deal with memory, so there's a part of the brain that's particularly called the hippocampus, is our sort of memory center. It's smaller. The parts of the brain, what's called the frontal lobe, that deals with behavior, emotional regulation, and so forth. It's not working properly. The parts of the brain that deal with learning and math, for example, it's not working properly. The parts of the brain that deal with processing visual and auditory information, so what we see and what we hear, is not working properly. We can physically get a window of perspective by looking at brains through imaging of these children that are not sleeping properly, and those brains are not normal. This is brain damage.
But
there's a reason.
Is it correctable?
Yeah. This is the beautiful thing about brains at an early age is that these brains have what we call plasticity. So the proper term is neuroplasticity. Is the brain just keeps sort of changing and developing, but we've got to realize that we're asking the brain to change and develop and work around a problem, and the brain will do its best, but again, there's a limit to where it's at. And if you had a choice between relying on the brain trying to solve this, or just relieve the problem that it's trying to solve, well, getting rid of the problem is actually a more beneficial outcome than relying on the brain being its own solution. So we sort of have that again, that advantage of things, but we're using that advantage in the wrong circumstances. So there's a very good reason that we don't let a 6-year-old drink alcohol. Okay, at the end of the day, as much as we've socially accepted it, alcohol is a brain poison. We know it's a brain poison. We sort of might decide not to acknowledge that to sort of justify our social norms, but at the end of the day, at a medical level, alcohol is a brain poison. There is a reason that we do not let 6-year-olds drink alcohol. There's even a reason we don't let 14-year-olds drink alcohol. And you can make the argument that we probably shouldn't let anyone under the age of 25 drink alcohol if we look at it from a pure science point of view in terms of brain development. The brain development continues throughout life, but in terms of that crucial brain development, it's sort of massive early on, and then petering out and plateauing, usually from the age of about 23 to 25 onwards. So any environmental insult that comes along that can affect the brain can leave its mark.
And then we
So
see it manifest and it shows itself more and more down the road. Now we have
absolutely,
adults with
absolutely,
all of these conditions that we could have.
absolutely, yeah.
So is it
So
ever
that's
too late to stop and help an adult
it's never
with
too late.
this
This
issue?
is the thing. It's never too early and it's never too late.
Okay,
And the best time to fix a problem is when you find it.
is when you
You
find
know,
it.
like any health condition. When should we fix this? Well, now.
Right.
Oh, but aren't they too young? They go, they're too young to have this problem. They're not too young to get it fixed. So, and then we come into the cardiovascular thing. So the cardiovascular, we have the heart and the blood vessels. So if we think about, what are the sort of leading sort of causes of disease and death in adults? Well, one of them is heart disease, and that ties in with high blood pressure. Well, guess what? This is what happens in children. Because we have a problem with the breathing, we have a problem with the oxygen supply. Part of the response is that the brain and so forth is going, hey, I'm not liking this environment. Heart, pump harder, give me more blood, give me more oxygen, give me more blood. Heart goes, all right, I'm going to pump a bit harder, going to pump a bit faster. It's going to work just that little bit harder. But what it encounters along the way is these changes also within the blood vessels that leads in children to high blood pressure. So one of we talk about high blood pressure in adults. We talk about what's called primary and secondary. Secondary means it's due to something. We can go, oh, they've got a problem with their kidneys, which affects their salt regulation, which means that it puts up the amount of the volume of fluid that's in their blood vessels, which as a result of that puts up their blood pressure. So that's what we call secondary hypertension. Hypertension means high blood pressure.
Right.
But in the majority, it's what we call primary. We go, look, it just happened, And if you think about that as a starting point, you just go, oh, it just happened. Well, that's a kind of weird thing to do, in the first
Right.
place. And if we then drill it back and we go, why did we have an adult that took some pathway of aberrant outcome that led to, high blood pressure? Sleep disordered breathing. So in children, the vascular changes that happen that we see changes in the tone of the little muscles. So within our blood vessels, there's tone. So because we have to divert blood to different parts of the body at different times. So for example, where I'm here at the moment, this is a conversation. This is an intellectual thing. So this is which part of my body is doing the work? My brain. So it's right. All right. More blood needs to go to the brain. It's morning time here. I haven't eaten. So blood flow to the gut. There's nothing there. Don't need to worry about that. I haven't moved yet. I haven't gone and done any sort of, physical activity. So muscles doesn't need anything there. It needs the baseline, but doesn't need any extra. But then, if I then go and have something to eat, and people realize this, for example, when you have lunch, you always just tend to feel that just that little bit flaky after lunch, just that little bit.
Right.
I just feel a little bit tired. That's because the blood's going to your gut more than your brain. Why? Because you've got a whole load of food there that has to go through a whole digestive process, and then it needs to be pulled out the gut and taken through your other body systems to be processed.
Right.
So it's just an automatic thing. So the blood vessels have little muscles that basically can open and close to regulate the blood flow. And they have a background tone. But in this sleep disordered breathing thing, because we have this stress response, and part of this stress response involves, basically, just to keep it simple, little adrenaline surges. That adrenaline causes the blood vessels to constrict, and it changes the tone such that there's a background tone that over time is elevated. So that therefore then squashes the blood vessels, which squashes the blood. And when you squash the fluid, the pressure goes up. So that's in simple terms. So we have children with high blood pressure and so forth. So that's that side of things. So we have this both cardiac and vascular changes, which again are remarkably subtle, but cumulative over time. So we have this thing where, I listen to a lot of sort of, health and podcast type things, really trying to find pockets where I can try and put my hand up and say, hey, look, everybody is talking about adults. They talk
Right.
about, oh, what are the background things, people get, adults get these diseases. And I'm listening going,
But it started back here. Have you looked at,
it started in childhood.
yeah.
Again, it's that silo thing. We're talking about world experts, world
Hmm.
experts in high blood pressure in adults. And they don't know about this other silo. So 20 to 25% of kids, have got
So how do we
these
fix that?
changes.
The silo? I mean, because it's not just US, it's everywhere. This is just
Yeah, yeah,
how
yeah,
all
yeah. No, no,
medical
no, no,
systems
no, no, no,
work.
no. Well, look, I'm in Australia. This is
Yeah.
this. It's
It's just
this
how
is
it
a reality.
is.
So,
Hmm.
so, so what happens? The way we fix it is you have people like myself that are anomalies that actually go, well, look, I know ENT backwards. That's what you'd expect. But then when I come, what I do different is when I come across this thing, I go, huh, I want to dig a bit deeper on this one. I'm going to go a little bit of a deep dive. And then as I do that, I just have this natural curiosity. I just want to know more. And
Hmm.
it's not also that I want to know more. I want to know what I'm doing wrong. You know, because if there's something here that I'm doing wrong, I don't have an issue with that, psychologically or ego wise. I didn't know it was wrong, but now
Right.
that I know, I, I can do it better. And
Right.
that's one of the things is that success is founded on failure. You talk about your
Hmm.
famous inventor Thomas Edison.
Hmm.
That invention of the light bulb. And you said, I just found 10,000 ways that it didn't work.
Hmm. Exactly.
If he tripped over it first time, well, that would have been a fluke. But it was entirely possible. But as it turned out, it was like, no, that didn't work. That didn't work. It's just like it just kept going. So if we'd said, oh, what a failure, it took 10,000 goes to get it right, we go, what a failure. But we don't. We go, wow, he invented the light bulb.
Look what he did.
You know,
Hmm.
so you sort of have that point where you don't look at the failures, you look at the success. And I have the same thing. I go, well, if only I had known that. And I think
Hmm.
this is the same thing. So again, how do we fix this? Well, we don't fix it overnight. We
Hmm.
fix it in small baby steps.
Okay.
And like I said, here I am, here, and again, there's even if it's only one parent, you know, you have 1,000 people that listen to this, and it's only one parent. It won't be. It'll be 20 to 25% of parents,
Right.
and
Right.
they might have more than one kid with this. And
Hmm.
then what happens is there's this cluster effect, because as soon as it's within a family, it's not unusual that it's like, the mum goes, oh, that was me when I was a kid. Or it's
Hmm.
dad is snoring too. And so it's like, oh, yeah, dad's been getting a bit grumpy, and yeah, he's on antidepressants and having some anxiety issues. And they
You
go,
really start
oh,
unpacking
and
everyone.
then it's just like,
Hmm.
well, it's also my I can see this in the cousins. And this
Hmm.
is what happens is that I start with this sentinel case, which is the first one, and then
Hmm.
the mum or whatever will go, oh, I've noticed that my 3-year-old is starting to show signs of this as well. Should I bring them in? I'm like, absolutely. And then they're like, oh, well, all their cousins like had their tonsils and adenoids out, and you go, right, it's in the family. You've
Hmm.
got the genetics, you've got the environment. There's this confluence of factors that are coming together, and the disease is manifesting. And then all of a sudden, I've started with the one case, and then I've got the family and the extended family, because they're all,
Hmm.
we start with the one kid that gets better, and everyone goes, oh my God, this is a different child. And then everybody is lining up for the please fix my child. Whatever you did, do
Do
it
it to
again.
this one. Hmm.
Yeah. So that's where this knock-on effect, compounds itself over time. But it happens slowly. But it's a trickle effect. So I
Hmm.
think about how do you get a valley? Well, you get a valley because initially there was a raindrop that went over a piece of rock, and then there was a second raindrop, and then there was a trickle, and then that trickle just slowly over time built up, and water created that valley. Just that natural effect of what we call erosion over
Hmm.
time. Took a long time to happen, but
Sure.
it got there. So that's what's going to happen here too. It's not going to be a flood. It's just going to be a slow chipping away and erosion of things.
Do you think the
So
parents are
that's
going to
that.
drive this with the advocacy? Is that what's going to drive change to have?
That's what that if you think about who knows about this more than anybody else, it's ironically the layperson, in terms of their numbers.
Mhm.
Why? Because, well, there's one of me, and this year I might fix 2,000 kids. Okay. So if I fix 2,000 kids, well, that's 2,000 parents. There's still only one of me, but that's 2,000
That now
parents.
know it. Hmm.
Okay, that now know. And even if they just, collectively, if only 10% of those parents tell another parent, well, that's 200 extra parents as a byproduct of
That
it
now
all.
know. Hmm.
Okay, so it's just that word of mouth thing, and so forth. So we start getting a compounding effect because of those 200. Well, say it was 10% again. Well, there's another 20, and out of that 20, there's another two. And then they say, well, that's where it peters out. Well, we still ended up with more than the 2,000 that I brushed against. There's still
Hmm.
only one of me. Okay. So, we've got in Australia, we've got, say, 500 ENT surgeons in total. Well, if I fix 2,000 kids, and 2,000 parents, well, like I said, numerically, there are more parents that then know about this than ENTs, just
Hmm.
numerically, but
Hmm.
you've got other ENTs doing this too. So, it's more than just my 2,000, it's everyone else's as well. So the majority of knowledge actually sits at a community level. What we need to do is have them be the advocates, and they often will be. They're so astounded and delighted that they just have this different child, that they have no reservations or hesitations about just
Sharing.
just basically putting their nose into other people's business, all for the right reason. They
Right.
might be at a mum's group, or they're at a, they've just gone and done their yoga and Pilates, and they're sitting around
Hmm.
having their coffee or whatever, and so forth. And one of the mums will say, "Oh, sorry, I haven't been here for the past 2 weeks. I've just been dealing with Sarah, who, my darling little 3-year-old just went through this operation and just had her tonsils and adenoids out." And they'll go, "Oh, is she getting lots of tonsillitis?" She go, "Oh, no, no, no. No, she was snoring and mouth breathing and stuff. And oh my gosh, I had no idea that this was a problem, because she wasn't getting tonsillitis, but she was just really waking up tired and so forth. And we got her checked out, and then eventually ended up with an ENT who noticed that they were too big and took them out. And she's just like this different child." And then one of the other mums will go, "Oh, well, that sounds like
My
my
child.
child.
Hmm.
Tell me more." And what should happen, and this is the failure of the health system. And there's many failures. We talk about, the Swiss cheese model of healthcare, which is basically, where are the holes that people fall through? Well, they fall through at the starting point. As soon as a child is born, we would make a massive healthcare benefit if we had this, basically just a simple booklet. And you got to make it simple. It's got to fit on a page.
Hmm.
Anything that's longer than that is not going to get absorbed,
Yep.
and not every parent's going to be on board. But just, a simple thing that says, "Hey, look, here is a little indicator list, so that if over the development of your child over the first few years, you notice these things, and we should put snoring and mouth breathing on that list." You say, "Look, if your kid starts to snore, they start to mouth breathe, they're waking up tired, that's the little red light that's turning on. That's
Hmm.
go get things checked over." Um, but it should also be at a health screening level, so that when these children, for example, are going through their community health clinics, it's not just, we're not just checking, how are they growing, and what's their
And
vision like, and
eyesight.
what's their
Hmm.
hearing like. It's like, what's their sleep like? What's
Yeah.
their breathing like? It's not on the
What's
list.
their behavior like? What's
Yeah,
their school
yeah.
performance like?
Yeah, it's not on the
Hmm.
list,
Hmm.
and then, we have the school health checks, which, I remember doing as a child.
Oh
What did they
yeah.
do? They checked my vision and they checked my hearing, you
Hmm.
know? They were the two things that they did. Um, in the mainstay, if we look at why a child will have a learning problem, hearing is very rarely an issue.
An issue.
Very
Hmm.
rarely. It's certainly on the list. Vision, very rarely. If you look at a group of children in a classroom, how many of them are wearing glasses because they can't see properly? Not most
Hmm.
of them. Okay. How many of those children have a breathing and a sleep problem? 20 to 25% of them.
Right.
How many of those children were asked as part of their screening process? None of them.
Mhm.
If you fill out a form, the school, wants to know about the background of a child as part of the admission process. Does your child have any physical issues? Do they have a vision problem? Do they have a hearing problem? Do they have diagnosed behavioral problems? Are they going to need education support because of that? No one asks, does your child wake up tired in the morning? Because if you're waking up tired, you're off to a bad
You didn't
start.
you didn't sleep.
Something went wrong, either sleep quality or sleep quantity, or there's a major health issue underneath it all, is in the background. But again, there's no little red indicator light and no guidance. Again, it's on my screening thing. When I say to the parent, do they wake up, tired in the morning? They go, all the time, as if, again, and it's usually the mum, just by circumstance. The mum is exhausted with this going on because they've got this child, that they need to get up and get moving and get to school and get on time because mum she's got stuff to do too.
But it's normalized. They're kids. They're tired. They don't like to go to school. They don't want to get up. This is what teenagers do. I mean, we normalize it.
Exactly. This is the problem. We've normalized pathology. And there's just that no recognition. There's just that again, things just don't click into place. It's like, the jigsaw puzzle. You've got all the pieces. You just don't know how they fit together. And then someone like me comes along and I go, well, that clicks into that and that clicks into that and then all of a sudden it's just like, that's how you solve it. So that's it in a nutshell. So what we need to have, with this in the background then is we need to have something that's useful and constructive for parents. And, and I can show off, how clever I am with, this enormous amount of knowledge, but that's useless if it doesn't translate into something that's packed up into something that's a nice little package. So what I sort of like parents to have as a little simple toolkit is like, all right, first up, most of the time you actually don't know what your child is doing at night because you don't go look and listen. They go to bed
after the age of about
one.
You don't check anymore.
No. Once they've gone down to bed, they're usually down the other end of the house because that's how we've constructed things these days. And so there is a complete element of I'm oblivious to it all. And it's not a criticism; it's a reality.
No.
So step one, you got to go watch your child every night for a week, random times, 5 to 10 minutes. Just make a small investment in time.
Okay.
Are they snoring? Are they mouth breathing? Are they stopping breathing at night? If you got that, that's enough. That's enough. You got ENT right there. Just keep it really simple. Now, if you want to layer it up, then you go, look, are they sleeping with their head tipped back? So that's that position. That is what we do when we do first aid in terms of mouth-to-mouth resuscitation type things.
Right, to open the airway.
Unless it's an infant, we tip the head back. Why do we do that? Because it opens up the airway. So if the child is sleeping with their head tipped back, they're opening up their airway. They're doing first aid on themselves to try and breathe properly. That's clearly not a good thing.
Right.
Are they sweating at night? They're going through those adrenaline surges. Are they, because they're having disrupted sleep, are they tossing and turning a lot? So when you sort of get there in the morning, their bed it's like a tornado went through.
Right.
Are they sleepwalking, sleep talking? Have they got night terrors or grinding their teeth at night? They're all aberrant sleep pathologies related to not being able to breathe properly at times. Are they waking up through the night and coming into your room? They have disrupted sleep. That's not normal. Okay, coming into the room, that's not normal. It's been normalized, but it's not normal. Okay, are they wetting the bed beyond a normal age? Okay, so is it 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 year olds that are supposed to stop? Well, there's a variety. There's where we draw, what we think is the line in the sand. But are they still wetting the bed? Okay, so there's these sorts of things that you can sort of add layers to if you want to get more sophisticated. But do they
just
snore?
watch them?
Do they mouth breathe? Are they stopping breathing at night? Yes. All right. ENT. The rest of it's window dressing. We need to keep, the ENT can sort the rest out, but let's start with that. Okay. So that's your simple parent screen in terms of their breathing and sleep in a nutshell. And if they can just walk out the door with just that simple screen methodology, we're going to pick up 90 to 95% of these kids that need seeing and help right there.
Yeah.
All right. But if we're tripping over them through their daytime problems, so they're having problems with their education, their emotional issues, their
Their
mental
attention.
health issues, and it can be just like exercise things. So, for example, they go out onto the soccer pitch and they're running around with a group of kids, and there's no real reason, but they just can't keep up. They're struggling. It's what we call exercise tolerance, which is basically, if you basically, we do it like, for example, with people with heart disease, we'll put them on a treadmill just to see, what their heart,
What they can
can
take.
cope with. So that's what we call exercise tolerance. Well, throw a group of kids onto a sporting field and get them to running around, play with a ball, or for example, well, what kids are just go, and what kids looking at them, you go, gosh, they're not very fit, are they? Well, they've got cardiovascular problems and breathing problems with the sleep disordered breathing. That might actually be what's going on, but it's all about the perception of it that then helps you understand the reality. So that's that part of it. But we also got to realize that, this isn't always about ENT either. Okay. Historically, it was about tonsils and adenoids, but there's a few other things that have crept into the conversation too. One of them is nasal allergies. So we call that hay fever. Okay. So with hay fever, we get the sort of the runny nose and the sneezing and the itchy eyes, and and again, we've normalized it. Why do you say that? Because we have this term. Oh, they've just got a bit of hay fever. It's just hay fever. Okay? They've just got allergies.
Right.
We've normalized a disease. We wouldn't go, oh, they've just got cancer. Oh, it's just a bit of cancer.
Sure.
We've normalized a disease. Hay fever is a disease. We
Yeah.
don't. We
Why did your
should
kid
never.
constantly get or deal with allergies or have annual sinus infections or?
Yeah. So we just normalized it.
Normalized it.
We've normalized pathology. But why did hay fever, nasal allergies trip into this conversation? Well, one of the things it does is it causes swelling within the nasal passages. And if that swelling is enough, it can block the ability to breathe through the nose to the point that you then mouth breathe. And here we are with mouth breathing again. Okay. Yep. So, and we look at allergies, certainly in my country, and I think it's probably similar in yours, and it's not unusual across many other countries too. In childhood, it's about 15%. So that's 1 in 7 children. Forget about tonsils and adenoids now. Pretend they never even exist. 1 in 7 children, nasal allergies, nasal obstruction, breathing problems, sleep problems from just allergies. And what do we know if we look at it just from an allergy point of view? They don't do as well at school and they're more prone to anxiety. Here it is again. We're landing on the same doorstep, okay? But without it necessarily being about tonsils and adenoids. And guess what? Some kids can have both, but it doesn't stop there. We talked about the adults that have the obesity. Well, guess what's happening? Our food is terrible. Our lifestyle is terrible. What used to be a disease of thin, scrawny kids is now becoming a disease of the adult pattern with overweight and obesity too. And again, what are we doing? We're normalizing it. We've got to just take a moment in time where we've got to let political correctness go to the side and say, are we dealing with a health problem? Go back and look at photos from the 1970s. Try and find that crowd of people. Try and find the person that's overweight. They're few and far between. As a society, we have gone down a wrong, bad pathway, but we have normalized it, and we are now feeling like it's an insensitive thing to do to highlight it and bring it to people's attention. And in the process of doing that, by normalizing it, we basically are allowing illness to be okay.
Something that we could fix.
And wellness to be okay. Instead of going, you know what, this is not how we are supposed to be. This is not how we're supposed to look. This is not, we are a product of our environment, and an environment really at the end of the day now is all one that's surrounded by us by privilege. You know, we're not having to walk the 20 miles to the water well to carry back those 20 liters of water every day.
Right.
You know, we don't have to do that anymore. We just turn on a tap. It's there. You know, that food, well, it's all in your fridge and freezer. How did you get it? Well, I got in my car and I drove down to the shop. There's no physical effort in that. There's no hunting or gathering and then working to the seasons and so forth. You know, we're just not, you know, engaging in something that we've done literally for thousands of years. You know, we've made life easier for ourselves. You know, majority of our transport is not by our own means. It's something that has wheels. You know, so, you know, there's all these things that our bodies are primed for, but we just don't use them. And you know, we've engineered our way into problems here. And I think we just need to just take a reflective moment and be honest with ourselves. You know, stop making excuses for things that are not good for ourselves. You know, and that's confronting, but it's a reality.
Right.
So that's what's happening in children now too, is they're getting the adult pattern of disease because of being overweight, because of being obese. And then we have this other thing where jaw development's a problem because, as I said, you know, not all the adults necessarily are overweight or obese. In fact, they're sort of the unlucky ones with obstructive sleep apnea because we dismiss them because they don't fit the stereotype. They're just not on our radar. We just walk straight past them. But they have, you know, skeletal and developmental problems where their jaws haven't grown and developed properly. So basically the jaws form the framework for then, you know, what's inside the airway. And if their jaws are underdeveloped, well, their airway is compromised.
It's going to be smaller, right?
It's smaller. But how do you get that jaw development as an adult? Well, because of how it grew as a child.
As a child,
so, you know, so 80 to 90% of your jaw development is done and dusted by the age of 12. So whatever you've got as an adult was basically the growth pattern up to the age of 12 in the mainstay. So when can we find aberrant jaw and development problems? Well, clearly in kids. And who's going to find that? Predominantly the dentists. And if we have a tooth focus where we have a look at, you know, are they brushing their teeth? Are they flossing their teeth? Have they got any cavities? And that's all we're worried about. And in the meantime, these jaws, which is what the teeth are connected to, are not developing properly, and they're just left to time. Well, then we have that going on. So if you have,
instead of
you know,
this airway-centric
jaws,
dentistry.
yeah. Well, if you have underdeveloped jaws, then, you know, you might have a resilience. You might get away with that. But if as an adult you get allergies, well, there's your tipping point. Or you get overweight and obese, there's your tipping point. Or for some reason, if your tonsils or adenoids play up, there's your tipping point. You know, anything that then comes along that basically in that, you know, you're a center of vulnerability, and you just need something that's just the straw that breaks that camel's back, and then you trip over into pathology and you've fallen off that cliff, and there's nothing there to catch you anymore.
And we're back to something that could have been caught had we known, or had we been looking for it back in childhood.
Absolutely. And when we talk about obstructive sleep apnea as a society, in the mainstay, our paradigm is in adults. You know,
Oh, absolutely. It's adult
health
males. That's what we
practitioners.
think of.
Yeah, we really focus on it's an adult thing. You know, that's where we dwell on it. You know, and the fact that it could be happening in kids, or it's happening in adults because of what happened in childhood. What you are having to concede is that through the development of that adult's life, the health system screwed up. And again, we can either acknowledge that and admit a mistake and use that as a learning opportunity and an opportunity for growth and development, or we can put our head in the sand and say, oh no, I've got my university degree from this prestigious place, and I've been doing this for 40 years. I know everything about everything, because, you know, and that's where the ego gets in the way. So like I said, I want to know what I don't know, because if I don't know it, and I should, when I come to learn it, I go, I really wish I'd known that 20 years ago. Well, I'm grateful for the fact that at least I know it now.
Right.
And I utilize it and I implement it. I've made my mistakes, as many as anyone else, but I use them as reflective moments of growth rather than just going to ignore that. I don't,
It's all about affecting
yeah,
change. How do we
yeah,
affect change?
yeah, absolutely.
And
So look, I hope, in terms of just trying to give some people out there an opportunity to get a broad brushstroke into things and understand that,
mhm,
it's not always about ENT.
right.
It can be about allergies. It can be about diet and lifestyle. It can be
Mhm.
about jaw development. So, if they're going to the dentist and the dentist is going, oh, their jaws aren't developing properly, well, that's got to be a red flag to saying, well, okay, so
What's
what do
going
we do
on? Let's
about
look
that?
at it.
You don't just find a problem and go, oh, and then just walk past it. You go,
Mhm.
well, hang on, rewind. All right. So what are we going to do? And go, oh, don't worry, we'll just let them grow there. And look, they'll probably get crowded teeth. And don't worry,
And then we'll
later
pull
on we'll
them
just
and
take
yeah.
those extra teeth out, and so forth, and we can straighten them up because they're all going to get a bit crowded. That doesn't fix the jaws,
And
you
that's
know.
back to that normalization again, right? The extra teeth. There are no extra teeth.
100%. Yeah, 100%.
Mhm.
Why, if someone was born with an extra finger or an extra toe, we recognize that
Right.
that's aberrant. We know that. But we're all effectively born with the same number of teeth. Why
Mhm.
on earth are there extra teeth then? There aren't extra teeth.
Right.
Now, look,
Right.
there are some times where there actually genuinely are extra teeth, but that's a pathology. But when we all have the same, in the mainstay, number of teeth,
Mhm.
well, why is that extra teeth
Why is
in,
it extra in that child, but the
in
same
that
child has the
child
same
that's got the
number?
same number of teeth as the other child? Why are we
Right.
calling them extra teeth? And it's
Right.
like, well, the teeth are attached to the jaw. It's the jaw that's the problem, not the teeth.
Mhm.
The teeth are
Mhm.
just fighting for the space that they've got. And if the jaw's a problem for the teeth, it's going to be a problem with the breathing later on in the
Yep.
mainstay.
Yep.
And and so it's like, hang on, we're on a road to pathology here. We got to get off this ride. This ride doesn't end in a happy place.
No.
So that's where we need a multidisciplinary approach to the management too. I can't fix jaws and teeth. I get the allergy doctors to help me with the allergies. So I go looking for the allergies. I can pick that up as an ENT, but I need the
Right.
allergy doctors to help me then manage it in the long term.
Mhm.
Um, these children have aberrant breathing patterns. I can clear the obstruction, but then they need rehabilitation and so forth, and they may not have been chewing and swallowing properly either, because having big tonsils or being mouth breather, they have to work different ways to chew and breathe and swallow. They're called, with
So we
the
need
coordination of things.
myofunctional
So
correction
this
and
is where the
work. Mhm.
myofunctional therapy comes into it. There's this whole thing where you basically you need a village, okay,
Right.
of people that come in and go, all right, here's the plan. Okay. So here's the sequence. First up, you got ENT problems. All right. The sequence is ENT always goes first. You got ENT problems. ENT always goes first. Let's get that out the way. That may not be our full fix, it may not be our permanent fix, but it's our quick fix. And it's
Mhm.
very effective. And it's just going to pull us out of trouble. So it's kind of like if someone's drowning, it's like, what do you do first? Well, look, you want to pull them out of the water, but hey, look, at the moment we can't do that. Let's throw them a life preserver. Let's at least stop them from drowning. So there's that. They're still in the water, they're still cold, and so forth, but they're not going to drown anymore. All right. We've
Okay.
got them to a point, and it's like, okay, what do we need to do now? Well, all right, now we need to get these jaws sorted. Okay. And we can start some myofunctional rehab, and we can start getting their allergies and calming that down. And if we
Mhm.
start getting all of those things sorted, then eventually we've got to the point where the helicopters arrived and the rescue team has dropped down and plucked that person out of the water, and we've got them on board and we've warmed them up and we've saved them from drowning and we've saved them from hypothermia and we've saved them from being eaten by the sharks.
Mhm.
Okay. But that took a coordinated effort of different things at different times. It wasn't an immediate fix. It wasn't just a one thing. It was
Right.
all these things that had to happen for
And
that
work
outcome.
together. and
Okay,
talk to each other.
it's the same with these children. You know, if their only problem is tonsils and adenoids, fine, that's their only fix. But if their only problem is allergies, fine, that's their only fix. But often these children don't have just one thing going on.
Right.
All right, they've got a multitude of things going on,
And
and
we're
it can
just not
be, you know, the
looking for
parents
it.
can be going, "Oh my God, you've got to fix all of this," and you go, "Yeah, you got to fix all of this because." You know, if you got a car with 4 flat tires, do you complain about the fact that you got to fix all 4 flat tires, or do you go and fix all all four flats? You go, well,
Right.
all right, well, I've got to fix all 4 flats. There's no point fixing 3 of them. Well, it made things better, but I still got a problem. Well,
Hmm.
this is the same. You've got to fix all of this.
Right.
You know, and that can be a journey at times. You know, it can take a while. But the outcomes, the health outcomes,
It's their
you know,
long-term health.
and things that we ultimately will never see because you know, we won't see that disease in pathology in that person.
Hmm.
That's a good thing. You
Hmm.
know, that's a good thing.
Absolutely.
So that you know, as best as I can, you know, provide to parents. At the end of the day, they're our advocates. They're our ambassadors. They're the ones that are going to be standing up for their own kids more than anyone else and saying,
Mhm.
no, I know that there is something
It's
wrong with
something.
my child. You know, I'm not a healthcare provider. I never went and did that university education that you've got, and I'm not suggesting for a moment, you know, that you know that I necessarily know more than you, but I know my child. Okay, I spend more time with my child than I've had with the past 5 minutes I've been sitting with you in your room. I'm telling you, there is something wrong with my child, and I
Advocacy.
want
Be
to
an
go
advocate.
and get it looked at and get it fixed. And then, you know, especially those ones that have had the battle to get there,
Mhm.
you know, and the challenges to get there and the frustrations of getting there, and then that gets fixed. And it's just like different child. They're like,
Mhm.
right, this can't ever happen again. And obviously that's where you know, this foundation is founded upon is
Right.
the journey that one child went through. That basically then had the parents that said, this can never happen
Happen
again.
again.
I'll
Correct.
tell you now, it already is. It happens time and time again,
Mhm.
but it's going to happen one time less every moment that a parent hears this message. And then that one moment less is become one moment and just a little bit less because we got another
Mhm.
advocate, we got another
Mhm.
ambassador, and then it just spirals upwards. And eventually, in some concept of time, we're going to know that this is a pathology and that parents in the mainstay, the majority of parents actually know it's a pathology. And also at the same time, the healthcare providers are going to know it's a pathology because that's where you run into problems too. It's all well and good for me to know this. There's a lot of healthcare providers, and that includes ENTs, by the way.
Mhm.
This isn't even on their radar.
Right.
It wasn't part of their education. It's not part of their knowledge base. And look, it may not be part of their focus. You know,
Mhm.
I'm an ENT, but I don't specialize in ear disease. You know, you can have major ear disease. I don't do throat cancer. You can get throat cancer. You know, they're both ENT conditions. Okay.
Right.
Now I
But
know
it's not your
enough about
specialty.
ear disease to send it to an ear specialist, someone that focuses on ear disease, or send it to the throat cancer team. You know, I know that, but I don't deal with it. But if you don't know that upper airway obstruction is a problem, and that, you know, no tonsillitis means no tonsillectomy, then you're not seeing the right type of ENT. Just like if you had, you know, bowel cancer, well, you wouldn't go and
Mhm.
see the breast cancer surgeon. If you had a shoulder problem, you wouldn't go and see the knee specialist. They're both
Right.
orthopedic surgeons, okay, just like we're all ENT surgeons. So again, if you know where circumstances prevailing means that you can go and see, you know, if it's a child, the pediatric ENT. If it's an airway problem, the airway focused ENT. You know, you'll get a different perspective and so forth there too. And that's where, you know, it obviously then needs to layer up within the healthcare profession too. It's all well and good, you know, to have these parents that know their child needs fixing, but if they hit these brick walls of ignorance within the healthcare profession, then
Right.
they
That's no
also,
good.
we also have a problem there. So it needs
Mhm.
to spiral up, in more than one place. But let's just start with the parents. They're the ones that know that their child has a problem and it needs fixing.
Advocacy.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much for all this amazing information and putting it in just language that parents can understand and really getting to the just such detail about what we're dealing with and why it's so critical that we address it
Yeah.
now.
Yeah. No, my absolute pleasure.